This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider.
Could it be an indication of just how bizarre things are when the UK economy has its biggest collapse in recorded history and no one is surprised? And that's even though the figures are worse than expected. A 20.4% dive in GDP is unprecedented. Compare it to the financial crisis of 2008 that saw a 6% drop in output. Meantime, an Ipsos Mori poll for the Evening Standard shows 7 in 10 people think the UK economy is only going to get worse in the year ahead. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, says coronavirus has had a severe impact. Our editorial column sees a path to recovery, but not without scars being left.
There are reasons for hope. In May and June, Britain got busier, and that will be reflected in data when it comes. A nimble response by the Chancellor has so far prevented mass job losses and bankruptcies, but the taxpayer can't pay the bills for the whole economy forever. As support is taken away, some businesses will find they aren't viable. On top of this, there is another chilling question. Having endured one of the developed world's highest death tolls from COVID, will we now go on to suffer one of the worst recessions as well? The OECD predicts the UK economy will shrink by 11.5% this year overall, just ahead of France and Spain. When things do grow again, we should be well placed. The OECD predicts 9% UK growth next year. But the horrific impact of this year's immense economic collapse will be felt for generations. And that's without the possibility of a no-deal Brexit to navigate just after Christmas.
The Evening Standard's consumer business editor, Jonathan Prynn, is with me now. Jonathan, how much is this an indication of what's to come?
That's a really good question. We knew that the economy was in an unprecedented lockdown. I think the size of the fall was slightly bigger than the city had been expecting, but it was within the ballpark. Now, the question is how quickly and what shape the recovery is going to be. May will be better for certain because the absolute sort of strictest form of lockdown came to an end in early May and has been gradually relaxed through the month. June will be better still. We'll have people going back to shops, high streets opening up. And so it should be a steady, if fairly slow recovery through the summer and into the autumn. I think what economists are very worried about is whether the recovery can get back to 100% of where we were before COVID, or whether it will get kind of stuck at about 85, 90% for the foreseeable future, because people are worried about going out as much as they were before. They're worried about their jobs, all sorts of reasons, which might mean the economy doesn't quite get back to 100%. And that has quite severe potential consequences for the number of people in work.
Which areas do you think contributed most? I was quite amused or sort of surprised or shocked about the fact that, obviously the UK pub industry was clearly very hardly hit. And I think that maybe says quite a lot about us as a nation.
The big ones were, hospitality generally. Pubs, restaurants, hotels were almost completely wiped out. Retail obviously had a really, really bad month. No shops were open. All they could do was online, and that didn't come anywhere near making up the shortfall. Motor manufacturing was big hit as well. Most of the auto plants were almost completely shut down. And construction is down 40% over the last 3 months. That's an absolutely huge reduction in a very important sector of the economy. Food retailing is obviously having a bit of a moment, actually, because we're not going out as much, so we're buying more from supermarkets. But the vast majority of sectors of the economy were extremely badly hit.
I mean, in terms of the global picture, like you say, we're all in the same boat. Everyone's, got a pretty gloomy and stormy period ahead. But, how does that compare in terms of our figures with, other countries around Europe, for example?
Ours are bad, possibly the worst in the developing world. The OECD predicted that our downturn in 2020 will be the worst of any of the major developed nations. Around 11% fall in GDP this year. Who knows, the way the April figure came in, it may be worse than that. But Britain does seem to be taking a bigger hit than most other countries, possibly because we went later into lockdown, and our emergence from lockdown seems to be more slow and painful than some of the other countries, particularly in Europe, where France, Germany, Spain, Italy are getting back to some degree of normality. Well, we're still a long way from that. The biggest human factor is going to be unemployment. We've been used to very low levels of unemployment. Apart from a relatively brief spike after the financial crisis, we've had low levels of unemployment for 20-odd years now. And anyone of my vintage who remembers the 80s and early 90s when there were 3 million people on the dole, and which is a cause of huge amount of human misery. That, sadly, unless we can get the economy going much more quickly than most economists are predicting, is where we're heading in the second half of the year, going into the winter of 2021, especially after the furlough scheme, which has been very effective in keeping people away from unemployment. As that unfolds over the summer and going into the autumn, we are looking at huge numbers of people without work, and that's obviously a massive human cost, which I don't think people have really taken on board yet, what may be coming down the line.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.